You can gently open your eyes, fidget in your chair, come back to the space. I'm extremely excited about our service today. The happy reason is that I always love when Matthew says anything in church at all, and I think you'll all see why soon. The other reason is that we've had some terrible, unexpected deaths in our community in the work that I do. And when I saw the topic today, I thought, not a coincidence yet again. So I'm really happy that you are here and leading us today, Matthew.
So I want to thank you so much for that introduction, by the way. I want to start by saying how honored my voice or this. Okay. Maybe better. Is that better? Cool. We have a full house. This is awesome. It feels really good to be back in person. I just want to say first that I'm honored to be speaking with you again. This is the third of what has become an annual poetry service, and special shout out to Travis for making a point to keep this tradition alive. He always reaches out to me every year, to schedule it, and so I'm excited to keep it going. The first talk I gave for the poetry service was called Ecstasy of Statement, which is a phrase from Walt Whitman, and it kind of just points to like the exhilaration and freedom that come from poetry. And the second talk I gave was called Poetry in the Beginner's Mind, and I was comparing the poetic state of mind to what some Zen Buddhists call the beginner's mind, and Shunryu Suzuki kind of describes it best in this quote. He says, "If your mind is empty, it is always ready for anything. It is open to everything. In the beginner's mind, there are many possibilities. In the expert's mind, there are few." And today I've decided to talk about death in poetry, death and poetry. And that was directly inspired by the fact that the writing group has decided to put together a book of reflections about death, which will be coming out in the next month or two. And that book itself is inspired by a sermon that Keola gave last year. So when I first started really writing poetry back in like 2007 or 8, after I had several poems, just like anything else, I started seeing patterns in my poetry, and one of the patterns was that death kept popping up. It wasn't like in every poem, and it wasn't the primary theme throughout all my poetry, but it definitely was there. And I also saw that a lot of the poems that I liked explored death as well. It makes sense that poetry explores death. I would say that in some ways, poetry is trying to put into language what is beyond language, trying to use words to point to something beyond words. And as Alan Watts said, poetry is trying to F the ineffable. And I think that, we could say that in some ways, death is an ineffable type of thing in our lives. It makes people kind of speechless sometimes, right? It's hard to talk about. It's mysterious, and it hovers over our lives, and it's present in our lives in various ways. And not only is death present in the sense that our lives are temporary and transient, but also the natural world is, things are always passing. The seasons pass, the years pass, the months pass, the weeks pass, the days pass, and each moment passes. And so I wanted to touch on kind of like 3 different ways to see the moment. We could say that each moment we're seeing the death of an old moment and the birth of a new moment at every given moment. We could also say that the past is carried into the present. It's not like every moment is born completely anew because it's carrying the past with it. And then we could also say that it's actually never not the present. The past and the future only exist in the present. And as Emily Dickinson said, forever is composed of nows. So, as a lot of mystics say, we're living in the eternal now, right? And I would say that poetry explores all of these things often, and actually explores the tension between those three aspects of the moment. And there's a tradition in Japan of Japanese death poems. And it comes out of the Buddhist tradition, and it's inspired by what is often called the 3 marks of existence in Buddhism. The 3 marks of existence in Buddhism is, number 1, nothing. I'm not sure if this is the right order, or if there is an order, but I'll say number 1 is that nothing has a fixed or permanent or unchanging self, or separate, I guess is probably the best word. Nothing has a separate self or a fixed self. That's 1 mark of existence. Number 2 is the material world is transient. And number 3 is when we attach ourselves to things that are transient as if they were not, then we can experience suffering, basically. So it's interesting to see how the tradition of Japanese death poetry kind of addresses those 3 marks of existence and explores them. I brought 2 tiny little poems that are in that tradition. The first one is by someone named Shinsui, and he writes, "Like dewdrops on a lotus leaf, I vanish." And the second small poem here is by Nandai, and he says, "Since time began, the dead alone know peace. Life is but melting snow." And so, you can see there, just like a lot of haiku and Japanese poetry, that it's kind of using the passing of the natural world as kind of a metaphor for the passing of our own lives, or the transience of our own lives. And there's actually a term in Japanese aesthetics called mono no aware. Maybe you've heard about it, and it's what that usually translates to is something like a sensitivity toward ephemera, or an empathy toward things, basically. And so it's interesting that in the Buddhist tradition there's that emphasis on not getting too attached to it, but then in this poetry, I think there's an acceptance and a gentle sadness at the passing of things, and that acceptance and gentle sadness, I would think that all of us experience that in one way or another. So another person I wanted to mention is Walt Whitman. Sorry, I think I mentioned him in every single talk I give. But he definitely talked about death a lot, and he had a unique and celebratory attitude toward death. And in one of his most famous lines, he says, "If you want me again, look for me under your boot soles." And, that seems to be pointing to a lot of things. It seems to be suggesting that, once his separate self passes, you can find him under your boot soles. And it seems like his poet self is always trying to embody or be a representative of the living, breathing life that is in front of us. And he constantly seems to be speaking to that. And we could also say that that line speaks to the third aspect of the moment that I said, which is that it is always the present. And so he's saying, if you want to look for me, like, look right here, right now, in the present moment, because this is what we have. So I think those are the main things I wanted to say leading up to this this last point. This is going to be a little bit of a short talk because I'm going to pass it to 3 members of the writing group to share their pieces, or at least pieces of their pieces, from what I've been calling the death book, but I think we're going to call it Thoughts on Death. So what are the takeaways from what I've said? I know that all the things I brought up we could talk about for days, right? So if you want to ask me about any of that at lunch or anything, we can talk more. But I would say that the passing of time sometimes hurts. The way the past is carried into the present sometimes hurts, especially in the form of something like trauma, individually and collectively. And I would say, nevertheless, the power that the past or the future has on us is always in the present. So I think that when we acknowledge that and accept that, we can maybe have more freedom and agency on how we navigate the effect that the past has on us right now. And though our lives are transient, our lives are beautiful, and we get attached to our transient, difficult, and beautiful lives, and we get attached to each other. And in our attachment to each other in this transient life, I would say that it's probably wise to keep in mind what Maya Angelou said when she wrote, "People will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel." Obviously, it is important what we say, it is important what we do, but in the context of our temporary lives, I think that one thing that transcends that temporariness is the way that we make each other feel and how that's passed on and spread. And it actually reminds me of what Oscar said today. Love is infinite. Love is the denial of death. And so how we make each other feel, we can make each other feel seen, we can make each other feel heard, we can make each other feel honored, we can make each other feel respected, we can make each other feel inspired and encouraged to tell the truth. And in our letting go, I think it might be wise to keep in mind what Ram Dass once said. He said, "Death is like taking off a tight shoe." So that's where I'm going to end the talk. I'm going to now read my poem from the Death Book, and then I'm going to pass it to the wonderful Arlene to share her piece from the Death Book. So here's my poem. When I die, I'll become a fly that grows bulkier in the rooms of those I love until they swat me dead, in which case I'll become the fly swatter. When I die, I'll enter the field of light where all at once I'll see all that's made of me until I unmake it and become light. When I die, I'll be buried in the footnotes of every book I've ever read, buried in the foothills of every mountain I've ever climbed. Death is a continuous line whose pen never leaves the paper, is the dog barking till it loses its voice, then scratches holes under the fence to escape. It is not the absence of light, it is not absent. It is the light that our eyes have not been trained to see. It is the process of breathing without being conscious of each breath. Thank you. So I'm going to invite Arlene to come read to us now.